Okay, so Emily already introduced me a little bit, but I just wanted to give like a very brief introduction so you kind of know a little bit more about who I am, who's talking to you right now. Unfortunately, I can't really see you all, but if you have any questions, want to, ask me something during the presentation, want to interrupt me at any time, that's totally fine with me. Just kind of try to make it so that I can see you and I'll stop and we can figure that out. Um, okay, but who I am. So my name is Ursula. I was born and raised in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Um, and I went to college in Portland, Oregon, where I studied psychology. And then after I got my bachelor's degree, I left the US for 9 years. I got a master's degree and then a PhD in Germany, actually. And then I decided I wanted to come back to the US, and I was lucky enough to get a position at Northwestern. So I've been here, I live in Chicago, but I've been at Northwestern since the fall of 2019 in the psychology department. So I am a psychologist, but I am a developmental psychologist, not a clinical psychologist or therapist. And this, for some of you, the distinction might be really obvious, for others not. This is something I hear all the time when I say I'm a psychologist. People say like, oh, do you want to analyze me? Or, you know, do you offer therapy? Things like that. And that's not the kind of psychologist that I am. So I don't study disorders or mental health. I study the development of identity specifically, but also other issues in terms of how humans develop from childhood through adulthood. So specifically at Northwestern, I focus on how diverse youth, so children through young adults, make sense of these different aspects of their identities. So primarily their ethnic, racial, and gender identities across time. So how that changes as they get older, and also across contexts. So in terms of interactions with family, in the school context, also how people are making sense of the political context in relation to how they perceive themselves and their role in the world. So yeah, specifically my title at Northwestern is postdoctoral fellow. So again, if folks aren't super familiar with the academic world, basically that just means I'm kind of in between a graduate student and hopefully becoming a professor within the next couple of years. Okay, so that's kind of my little spiel about who I am. And I will jump into what I'm going to be talking about today with that. So I mentioned here that I focus on these different aspects of identity or different identity domains, but we can also think about how these different parts of identity intersect with one another. And that's really what I'm going to be talking about today. So I'm going to try to ask you to raise your hands. How many of you have heard of this term intersectionality? Okay, it looks like just maybe one or two folks. So that's great. That's good. Then I get to talk about something new, which is exciting. So intersectionality as a term was coined by this woman you can see here, who is a legal scholar and lawyer and professor of law, Kimberly Crenshaw, in the late 80s. And in an interview, which is quoted here, she says, intersectionality is a lens through which you can see where power comes and collides, where it interlocks and intersects. Then she went on to say, it's not simply that there's a race problem here, a gender problem here, a class or LGBTQ problem there. Many times that kind of framework erases what happens to people who are subject to all of these things. So specifically, when this framework was kind of first being used and studied, it was really in relation to law. So Kimberly Crenshaw was thinking about and looking at cases where Black women in particular were experiencing workplace discrimination that was different from the white women in the same workplace and the Black men. And they were not they were not being listened to, basically, or they didn't have a way through given legal structures to argue their case, because they were basically being told, well, this isn't a race issue because these Black men, your Black colleagues, aren't facing this who are men, and it's not a gender issue because the white women aren't facing it. And so they had no legal recourse. And so that's what Kimberly Crenshaw was really looking at is, well, it's not just a race issue, not just a gender issue. These Black women were facing specific discrimination as Black women. And so that's where this really started out being talked about and examined within the academic context as something that's really related to law and how this intersection of gender and race was being experienced. So specifically in relation to Black women. But intersectionality, even though this term was coined in the late 80s, it goes back, I mean, arguably to, hundreds and hundreds of years. But we can see evidence of this kind of discussion of the intersection of race and gender. For instance, going back to Sojourner Truth. So Sojourner Truth at an abolitionist convention in 1851 made this now pretty famous speech, Ain't I a Woman, where she talked about having done quote unquote men's work and also having done quote unquote women's work, having had many children, having the experiences that other women have, but being erased as a Black woman within the abolitionist movement. So even though this name intersectionality wasn't around yet, there's a long history of discussion and recognition of the ways that race and gender in particular intersect to shape individuals' experiences. So I want to just jump to today and sort of talk about some examples of what contemporary intersectional discrimination looks like, just to give some kind of context to this discussion. So you probably all are familiar with discussions of the wage gap, so the earning differences between men and women. But if we just talk about, quote unquote, differences between men and women, we don't necessarily get a full picture. We don't really see what that difference looks like across different groups of women, for instance. So here's data from the Census Bureau from 2018. I don't know if you can see the labels, but the orange bar is average white male earnings, and then Asian women, white women, Black women, and Hispanic women, so that we can see there's a disparity between white men and all of these different groups of women, but those differences, but there are differences within this group of women at large. So this is just one example of how we can think about differences in experience and differences in discrimination, for instance, in the workplace, across different intersections of race and gender. If we want to think about the pandemic and COVID-19, which probably none of us need to think about it too much extra right now, but there are a lot of good examples of ways we can think about intersectionality in relation to the pandemic as well. So even though we know we all are very deeply affected by this pandemic, we also know that some groups of people are more likely to get sick than others. So when we're talking about this, it's not race that puts some people at particular risk, but long histories of racial oppression. So for instance, we know that historical racism shapes where people of different races live, the types of jobs they have, and access to education and healthcare. So for instance, these things are often talked about, or disparities in COVID-19 are often talked about in terms of pre-existing conditions, but we can also use intersectionality really to meaningfully understand why, for instance, although 30% of Chicago residents are Black, 60% of deaths early on were among Black individuals. So these are very tangible results of long-standing intersectional uh, discrimination and racism that offer us very, very real life examples right now. So we also know, for instance, that jails and prisons have been COVID-19 hotspots across the country, also including here in Illinois. And we know that Black and Latinx individuals are more likely to be arrested and are disproportionately given longer and harsher sentences than their white counterparts who have committed the same crimes. So meaning this is another situation where systemic racism is affecting who is likely not only to be sent to jail or prison, but also who's likely to get sick and potentially die in a jail or prison. And so these are pretty intense examples of how these system level issues affect individuals. One more example, so this Northwestern study shows that although most scientists report having to slow down their research since the start of the pandemic, those with young children are particularly affected, and specifically women. Women are often asked to cover childcare more than men, even in households where both parents have full-time jobs. But this particular study does not examine further intersections, which might reveal even greater disparities. So for instance, among women of color or women with physical disabilities. So by not including this sort of additional analysis, we really only get part of the story. So again, if we're just comparing by gender or just comparing by race, but not thinking about these intersections, then we don't really get a very nuanced picture. And what winds up happening is that very often, for instance, we're just thinking about or just even studying populations who are predominantly white. And so often, by taking an intentionally intersectional lens, we can kind of shift away from just thinking about white populations as the norm or as generalizable, and instead remind ourselves that there are these differences based on additional social identities and axes. Right, I already mentioned that. So I did mention race and gender here specifically, and if we think about kind of the roots of this framework, it really was about race and gender, but intersectionality has been expanded beyond just looking at that intersection to also look at a number of other important intersections. So in terms of nationality, immigration status, sexuality, and disability are key areas where there's a lot more research now taking this kind of intersectional lens. Another part of this discussion is whether or not intersectionality can help us understand kind of the other end of that spectrum. So not just those who are harmed by systems of discrimination, but also those who are privileged by systems of advantage. So for instance, if we're studying heterosexual, able-bodied, middle to upper class white men, naming these intersections and thinking about the ways in which these intersections affect the experiences and identities of these individuals can also help us reflect on their trajectories and their development.
I have a question.
Yeah.
What's up here now? A whole bunch of things, including family structure and social class. Education doesn't show. Why not?
Education is absolutely part of that and definitely important. So it wasn't an intentional oversight. These are just sort of some important categories or systems that I chose.
Education in view is not an important category?
No. I'm definitely not saying that. Actually, most of my research focuses on education, so it is somewhat strange that I didn't include it. These are just examples, but this is certainly not an exhaustive list. These are just examples. But you're definitely right that education is very much related to this discussion, and certainly often is included, and there's a lot of intersectional research looking at educational disparities, educational outcomes, etc. So that actually is kind of a good lead in to thinking about how psychologists, so folks like me, are using intersectionality to study identity. So what I was just talking about previously in the previous slides is sort of a more traditional foundational way to think about intersectionality. So thinking about the system level, kind of these big picture things. But psychologists, we focus on individuals. So really how individual people make sense of the world, their perspectives, beliefs, experiences, etc. So what does it look like then to take this kind of system level framework and use it to study individuals? Well, that's one question that I and some of my colleagues have been trying to tackle. One way we're doing so is by conducting a systematic literature review of all of the psychology research that has been conducted on identity through an intersectional lens. So what this means is that we basically looked for all of the scientific research studies that have been published in psychology journals that are focusing on the study of identity using this framework of intersectionality. And what we found is that it's pretty new. So the first paper was published in 2001. We did the search in 2019, so that's our time frame. But we didn't say we're only looking at the past 20 years. It's just that research wasn't really being done within the field of psychology using this framework prior to 2001. So it's really pretty new within this discipline in particular. And so thinking about, okay, it's very new. I'm not going to get into all the different types of research being done that we found. Instead, I'm just going to offer you a little bit of an example of the type of research that we're doing in my lab, in my research group, using this intersectionality framework. So for instance, we have conducted lots of different interviews, but in this case, these are interviews with kids in middle childhood to early adolescence, so in sixth grade. Um, and what we find is that when you let kids talk about their race and gender, some kids do bring up issues from an intersectional perspective. So for instance, this participant who we're calling Sarah said, I mean, at this school, like, I think some teachers, I get special treatment because I'm a white girl. So in this interview, then Sarah went on to talk about how she specifically saw that both white boys and the black girls in her class were treated differently by her teachers than the white girls who experienced specific privilege. So she talked about how the teachers trusted the white girls in the class more than the other students, and that this impacted her and made her experience different than those of her classmates. So this is really important. This is important for Sarah's identity, for Sarah's educational experience and educational opportunities, but also for the other kids in the classroom. And so this is a clear example of kids who are pretty young making sense of these kind of racial and gender-based disparities that are going on at this system level, but that are, in this case, really impacting their daily lived experience. So this boy, Jason, also was aware of these experiences and said, I don't know, you just have to like work harder when you're a Black boy. And then he went on, so then we asked him for examples, and he went on to talk about basically the inverse of what Sarah was telling us. So he is very aware that some of his teachers expect less of him, that they treat him differently as a Black boy. And so as psychologists, it's our job to recognize and to try to understand these different experiences when we study identity development in particular. So making connections between individuals and how their beliefs and behaviors also shape the world around them. So thinking kind of more broadly, how can intersectionality inform our research? I've talked about some of these points already, so it can help us recognize the links between these social identities. So rather than just asking about gender, we can look at gender, but be attuned to these within group differences. So when I say within group, not just asking about boys and girls, but looking at across the spectrum, how girls are talking about their experiences, how they're making sense of their experiences, for instance. Intersectionality can also help us acknowledge the interaction between individuals and their environments. So a lot of psychology research happens in laboratories. It happens kind of away from the real world. And there's a lot of us who are critical of that, who are arguing that we really need to be doing the opposite. We need to be studying in context the ways that individuals shape their worlds and are shaped by their worlds. And we believe that this framework can help us do that. And then also, as I was saying, it can help us explore the plurality of experiences within an identity category. So whether we're talking about women, immigrants, gay men, etc., whatever the social category might be, it can help us recognize the differences of experience within that category. And then we also think that it can help us understand privilege as well as oppression and discrimination. So what should change when we're thinking about moving forward? So throughout history, most psychology research, arguably as is the same for most research within science, has been conducted by white researchers on white individuals. And recognizing diverse experiences will just help us better understand all people. So it's really a pretty simple takeaway when you get down to it. We can't understand human nature if we're only studying certain humans. So this is a way to help us recognize that and address that. So last overall takeaways from this very brief and fast presentation. Intersectionality can help us recognize these overlapping systems, like I talked about in the first slides, and also it can help us understand individuals within these contexts. And there's just a lot more work to be done. We're just at the beginning. Okay, so that was it for me. Thank you so much for listening. And if folks have questions on any part of that or anything related at all, I would be happy to talk about them.
The title is intersectional. What, you're a psychiatrist, or you're a major.
Psychologist.
What are the other speakers? Are they same or in other disciplines?
I'm sorry, I couldn't quite hear you.
You're a psychiatrist or a student. Are the other speakers today psychiatrists, or are they from other disciplines?
No, I'm a psychologist, and no, Karis is not a psychologist. I don't actually even know how she identifies in terms of her discipline. We'll hear in a moment.
I guess my question is, because some of your other slides reference that there's a sociology aspect to these things besides the psychological aspect.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so we're going to hear that, or is that different topic?
No, I think Karis's talk is totally separate. So we're both just bringing our own research, but our talks don't align with one another.
Go ahead.
Well, I just have a question. You ended up with that white people have done studies with white psychology studies, and that we need to have more. But it didn't sound like, so the studies with white people, from what you're saying, it sounds like several of the white people are different than the other ethnic groups or classes of people. So you need a Black psychologist to study a Black group of people. You need a Latino to study Latinos. That way they can all get each race properly identified and understood better.
No, I'm sorry. That wasn't clear. Those two things are not linked. So those are two statements that are kind of separate statements. So psychology as a discipline has been disproportionately white. So the overwhelming majority of psychologists throughout US history have been white, although that doesn't reflect our country. So that's one issue. So who's doing the research in general, regardless of what the research is. It's just been disproportionately done by white folks, like myself. The second part of that statement, that the populations who have been studied are also mostly white, is also a big issue. So in psychology, like in most science, a key aim of a lot of the research is to try to generalize. So you are trying to figure out, based on hypotheses, if a certain construct, a certain idea holds true for a large group of people. And so a big problem within the discipline that's been talked about more and more over the past couple decades is that when most of the folks who are taking part in psychology research are white and generally mostly middle class, and well educated, and then we're saying based on that their experience is generalized to everybody, we're finding out that that's just not true. It's not true, for instance, that a college educated white man perceives the world in the exact same way as, you know, somebody who maybe just didn't go to college, and is a person of color who lives in a different part of the country, for instance. Like there's, again, just all these different layers that come into play. And so that's just a big kind of issue of social justice that the discipline is wrestling with. And again, it's not just psychology, it's academia in general, but it's something that is very much related to this work, and that this framework makes very clear, when you do look at all of those different layers coming together. But I definitely do not mean to be advocating for the fact, or for the notion, that only Black scholars can study Black populations. And I also definitely am not arguing that there are group differences. I think kind of the opposite. This framework really helps us see how we are impacted by these systems, but it's not that there's something inherently different about people of different ethnic backgrounds, for instance. It's just that because there is systemic racism shaping our country, that shapes our opportunities and experiences, but it's not about cultural differences. That's not what I'm talking about today. Any other questions or thoughts?
Go ahead.
Awesome. Great job, Ursula. Thank you so much. We will switch over to Karis. And like Ursula said, Karis is joining us from a completely different type of science. So she's going to be talking about Parkinson's disease.
Yes. All right. Can